Today I want to talk about a few things tying all of this together at a higher metaphysical level. So we've seen these situations of people sort of glitching out and freaking out on airplanes, and it's almost as if society is getting more and more insane, and it's more than just a physical chemical situation. It's not just the drugs and all that. That's getting really bad, but there's something else going on, and I think a lot of people are picking up on this. I've been watching a lot of clips, a lot of analyses in the last year about the paranormal. And I know a lot of that stuff is goofy and a lot of stuff is silly, but there's actually, it seems to be an increase in a lot of these manifestations, a lot of these bizarre phenomenon that are in many ways inexplainable. That doesn't mean there's no explanation, just means that it doesn't fit with the current paradigms and models that we have for how we understand what exists, what doesn't exist, what's real, what's not real. And so one reason for that is that modern society is premised on the idea that really all that exists is physical matter, right? So when you hear me talk about materialism, I'm not talking about a desire for more and more junk, but really the idea that the only thing that exists in the universe is physical, material, cellular, molecular, atomic matter. That's it. Nothing else exists. Your mind is just a brain state. It's just gray matter. There's not actually a mind. The mind and the brain are the same thing. And so this worldview is in many ways an operating system, right? There was a great conversation here on it. And David, the Cheetah Uri, David I was getting into this, and he was making a great point that we tend to have an operating system, a program that we see the world through. And that will really limit and determine us in terms of what we believe exists or doesn't exist, depending on the operating system. So if we have a materialist operating system, then everything will be read in that way. We'll think, oh, that only material things exist, pure matter. So anything that occurs has to have a naturalistic, materialistic explanation. And really, this is a post-Enlightenment, post-Darwinian, post-Newtonian view. The weird part about this, though, is that modern physics, in many ways, in many places, as well as other sciences, actually no longer follows or believes that older model. So both Darwinism and Newtonianism have pretty much been discarded in modern physics. I'm not a physicist. I'm not trying to argue for one view per se, but I'm just pointing out that the dominant views kind of set the stage or the lens through which we read the world at that time. And then when those views begin to crumble, society has a new perspective. They take on alternate views, whatever. And reality begins to be seen and read in a different way. It's kind of like the way that we read a book. Sometimes we read a book, maybe you read the Bible or you read a famous piece of literature, Lord of the Rings, I don't know, whatever, Dostoevsky. You read it one time when you were younger. And you read it now and it comes alive. You see so much more there, right? The Bible works this way where you read a lot more into the text than you did maybe when you were a teenager or whatever. I was reading a book recently. We did a book review of this, Brave New World. I read it 10 years ago and I thought I had it all figured out. I read it again recently and I noticed all kinds of things I'd never seen before. Of course, the world, I would say, kind of operates in that same way. We read reality. It's like a book that we read and we decode it. And the mind functions in a way to decode that reality, that information that comes in. And like Alex and David Icke were discussing yesterday, our minds are attuned, our senses are attuned to interpret one level of that reality, one dimension of that reality. Or I know it's three dimensions and then time. I know that, but I'm saying that one level of reality, including those dimensions, is how we see things. But we know in mathematics, even mainline mathematicians and physicists point out that math shows there's higher dimensions. People like Brian Greene or Lisa Randall. Lisa Randall has a book called Warped Passages. And in that book, she talks about mathematics, things like quasi-crystals that are used to make non-stick pans. The mathematics and the geometry of those structures shows there's higher dimensions. There's next level stuff going on. So even math, even physics nowadays points to other dimensions, other realities. And some people have theorized that as humans change their perception, we might actually be tapping into those dimensions, those are higher realities, and we might actually be reading reality in a new way. Now, I'm not saying that the mind causes everything to occur or that everything's a projection of the mind. That's kind of a Carl Jungian view. And maybe we could bring Jordan Peterson in, and he could talk about Carl Jung all day, right? Carl Jung. I'm just kidding. We're not going to bring Jordan Peterson. But he has an insight there, which is that reality is seen like a book in the ancient and medieval world, right? Dr. Peterson makes this point. And I think there's something there, because Carl Jung is right to say that, yeah, we do interpret the world and see the world through a pattern of archetypes. And so there's patterns of archetypes that help us structure and interpret the world. There is some connection possibly between the human mind and the human soul actually being perhaps the portals or the gateways, so to speak, to the spiritual world. So a lot of people think of like, are there higher dimensions? And, is CERN tapping into this or something like that? I mean, I don't know, and I don't claim to know. But one thing that's interesting is that ancient religions, whether they're across the world, whatever they are, animism, polytheism, Christianity, all of these ancient religions and worldviews posit that the real gateway between the physical world and the spiritual world isn't some portal out in outer space, or it's actually the human soul, the mind. The human soul is the portal between this world and other worlds. So what I'm getting at is that it's very possible that there is a sense in which, as humans change their worldview, as they shift away from the paradigm of materialism, Darwinism, Newtonianism, and into alternate views, alternate perspectives, they are perhaps even tapping into other dimensions, and they're beginning to read and decode reality in a new way, and in a different way, which does read perhaps higher dimensions or spiritual things, spiritual phenomena. I'm not saying Bigfoot's real. I'm not saying Nessie and the Ogopogo. I don't know, right? I'm not saying that every stupid video or TikTok is actually demonstrated. I don't know that. And a lot of these things obviously are silly. They're fake. But a lot of things are occurring right now, and they're getting more and more intense and more crazy, which are unexplainable or paranormal. They're above the normal. In the ancient medieval world, metaphysics was not the study of witchcraft or angels and demons per se. Angels and demons and these kinds of things, that would be under the classification of metaphysics. So, now if you go into a Barnes and Noble or a bookstore or whatever, if you see metaphysics, it's like all witchcraft and alchemy and all that kind of stuff. But really, metaphysics is just reality. It's a study of reality. And we all have different models of reality. And what I'm getting at is just that our models, our paradigm, our system, our worldview is the lens by which we interpret reality. And if we, from the outset, don't conceive of certain things even being possible or even existing, then we'll never consider the information or the evidence that might suggest those things. For example, if you think about the way that people who don't question 9/11, or they don't question big scale events, or they don't know about false flags, they don't believe that there's even the possibility of a false flag, then their perception is limited, and any information that you bring them, say, about evidence that 9/11 was a false flag or any other 7/7 was a false flag, it won't even be within their purview. It won't even make it into their circle of what's possible. And this idea of the circle or the psyche or the consciousness as a circle which is contained is actually an ancient alchemical and sort of a secret society symbol which demonstrates control. I recently did an interview with a long podcast with Dr. James Lindsay and a guy who was an intelligence consultant throughout the post 9/11 situation to the Pentagon on Islam. His name's Stephen Coughlin. He does a lot of philosophical analysis, and he was looking at how worldviews work in this way. And he noticed that if you look at the circle as a kind of magic circle, right? And I don't mean literally a magic circle. I just mean as an image of the psyche and how we view what's possible and what's not possible. He says that the mainstream media, as an example, and mainstream education, they give you the circle with which you can work within, and that's it. So any possible thing outside the circle isn't even considered a valid question. And that's precisely the model for how the mainstream media has controlled the narrative. You can only ask questions within the circle. Everybody knows about the controlled two-party system that we've been dealing with for so long. That's another easy example of this, right? You want Coke or Pepsi? Well, what about other options or other possibilities, right? Those aren't even considered valid questions. There's a great philosopher named Eric Voegelin who actually wrote about this. His whole approach to modernity was that scientism and technocracy tell you what questions you're allowed to ask from the outset within that circle. And so I'm saying the same way, you can take that and apply it to how we interpret and read reality. I often talk about religious concepts, spiritual concepts, mystical concepts, these kinds of things. And people think, well, that's impossible. It doesn't exist because they're running on a program of naturalism. They're not able to understand or see or consider the possibility that there are bigger explanations. Maybe the physical world is just a piece of the picture, a piece of the puzzle. Maybe there's a lot more going on, right? And we've been locked into a box, which actually is in Brave New World, right? This circle, this box, about you're given a specific prepackaged worldview by the entire system, whether it's mainstream education, mainstream media, pop culture, toxic, garbage, fake pop culture. All of that is giving you a narrow, limited, prepackaged system view that will never allow you to ask or go beyond that box or that circle, right? It's a very limiting thing, and that's done by design. In fact, a lot of stuff that you hear me talk about when I talk about philosophical topics, you might think, oh, that's a bunch of obscure nerd stuff. Nobody cares about your philosophy. It's irrelevant to my daily life. Do you know the top psychological warfare experts, the Tavistock social engineers, the top engineer, trainer, control people, the controllers in the Brave New World lingo? You know what they study and have studied for many years? Worldviews, worldview warfare. Weltanschauungskrieg, the manipulation of perception, right? I think, isn't it Kissinger has something like the quote, something like, it doesn't matter what's true, what matters is people's perception of the events. So managing and controlling perception is everything to the system. And that's why they study worldviews, philosophies, ancient philosophies, to give you your own self-image, your own the story that you have of yourself, your origin, your narrative, changing images of man, really famous global elite text. It's a white paper from Stanford Research, SRI, the same entity that studied remote viewing and occultism, Satanism for the CIA. SRI, all true, all real. Men who stare at goats, studying all these esoteric New Age practices. First Earth Battalion, that's all real stuff. Who was doing that? Stanford Research, high-level academia, social controls, social engineering, all working with Tavistock. SRI and all of that is the American version of the UK Tavistock. And they're interested in creating your perception and worldview and controlling it, limiting it so that you can be controlled. That's where all the tech censorship comes in, because the part of the tech and all of the screen living that we do is to make sure you're in a feedback loop. What's a loop? It's the same circle. It's the circular economy that you can never get out of because it's a trap, right? Remember the ancient Hindu symbol of the wheel, that you can't escape this reincarnation wheel. That's the wheel of time and space that's supposed to entrap you from these people's perspective. Don't go anywhere. This is the Alex Jones. My guest host Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis. We're talking about the metaphysical, the mysterious, the unknown, and worldviews, and how our worldviews give us the lenses by which we interpret the world, our they live glasses. So I was thinking about the experience that many people are having of increasing experiences with the demonic, right? More and more phenomena, people saying that they're seeing people, change in appearance. They're seeing weird glitches, manifestations. And my theorizing is that this could be as a result of people move away from the paradigm of materialism and physicalism and into situations where we're considering the possibility of alternate realities, alternate dimensions. I don't really believe that there's multiverse. I think that there are higher and lower dimensions. And so sometimes people might be mistaking that for a multiverse. But regardless, this makes sense in the paradigm that is open-minded, that is open to understanding the possibility of there being higher and lower dimensions, that there's other spiritual realities beyond just the physical plane. And a lot of people that, for example, are engaging in excessive drug use, there's this phenomenon of people who many of them, not just a few, but many people are doing excessive amounts of Benadryl. A lot of teenagers, young people, which I think is ridiculous. I would never recommend anybody do this, but they're having these experiences of seeing the same entity, the Hat Man, which I think is probably something obviously demonic. A lot of people who've done intense LSD doses and so forth, even groups of people, they'll have a common experience of seeing the same hallucination or manifestation. And again, to cite Dr. Jordan Peterson, in his courses, his lectures, he actually talks about this as well. He talks about how would we have the same hallucination, right, going on between people that are in a group taking a drug. I have friends who have had this experience and they've talked about it. Well, that suggests more than the phenomena or the entity being purely chemical reactions in the brain. They might be chemical reactions in the brain, but they also might be tapping into higher realities, lower realities, other dimensions, hell dimensions, hell world, hellscape. I don't know, but I'm saying that that's very possible. And a lot of people's stories overlap and have commonalities. Likewise, for example, Dr. Peterson cites the work of the famous comparative religion scholar Mircea Eliade. And Eliade had analysis of the commonalities among shamanic traditions. So it doesn't matter where you are in the world, whether you're in Mongolia or South America or wherever, the shamanic experience, I'm not saying be a shaman, I'm just saying that the patterns of the shamanic experience are the same. They have the same structures and cycles. For example, the shaman does something to cause the altered state of consciousness. He goes into the spiritual realm. He is then dismembered by the gods, the deities, whatever. He might be consumed or destroyed, and then he is put back together. He is reassembled, and then the shaman comes back from the trip, and he's now enlightened, or he's had his third eye, or whatever, however you want to. He has a spirit guide now. This occurs in a consistent pattern across the world. Why would that be? If, for example, all of these religious systems were completely human constructs. The modern post-Darwinian Enlightenment account of religions gradually begins to say, well, they're all just sort of social constructs, right? We're all just making this up as we go. It doesn't really have any ancient medieval connection, or there's no truth really behind it. These are just human creations, right? Like LARPing fan fiction for the social order or something. But why and how would it be possible that even amongst the polytheists, the shamans, the animists, the shamanic figure, that archetype, why would they have the exact same ritual experience across the world? And it can't just be because they have some common root, because after several generations, there would be no connection between these people. They wouldn't know about a common root. Well, another possibility, which even Aldous Huxley hits on in the Doors of Perception, which we covered here in the 4th hour a couple months ago, Aldous Huxley, who's himself a big proponent of doing all these things, right? He sees this as tapping into other realities, other spiritual worlds, other mental worlds. He doesn't know how to explain it, but he admits that that's where the data seems to go, you see. And I'm saying that comparative religion says the same types of things when it comes to explaining these phenomena. I'm not saying that every world religion and every claim of superstition is true, but I'm saying that you can have true and false in a system, right, in a worldview. So if we find commonalities amongst all the world religions when it comes to the demonic, when it comes to these manifestations, then perhaps religion has something to say philosophically about what those things are, what those manifestations are. And why is it, for example, that we see a lot more demonic possession or these manifestations in societies that are so-called considered primitive or third world or whatever? A lot more superstition, so-called, in those. Well, they have a paradigm, a worldview, where they see things in a religious context. Everything is alive. Everything is part of the divine spirit, right? I'm speaking of like animistic religions, right? So for them, their reality, their worldview is structured in that way. They have a different set of glasses that they read the world through. And so it's not surprising that we would see more and more manifestations of these kinds of things in those cultures, because they see that as fundamental to reality. In modern Western materialist society, we may not have seen a lot of that before because we read reality in a different way. And so we limited the possibilities of what does and doesn't exist, good and evil, right? Now, I'm saying that's its own kind of delusion, right? If you read Screwtape Letters, for example, the great book where the demon Screwtape is messing with a guy and trying to convince him of different things like atheism. And atheism is a very powerful demonic presence and spirit in sort of the C.S. Lewis theology there, spirituality, because it lulls man into a kind of a delusion that he's got it all figured out, he's got a grand narrative, but then sometimes reality breaks in, especially crises. When we have a lot of abundance and luxury and we have really decadent societies, when atheism sets in, usually that leads to the collapse of that society. Even historians and philosophers of history, like Spengler, right? Spengler has noted this cycle of civilizations. And then when they kind of get to this atheist phase, this is where they start to have the collapse, the breakdown, because there's no longer meaning. Meaning breaks down. When meaning breaks down, society breaks down. And again, Tavistock studied Spengler. Keep that in mind. Now, Spengler wasn't being nefarious. He was just kind of a weird, eccentric historian, philosopher of history. But Tavistock studied Spengler to weaponize his philosophy and his system, to figure out how could we actually collapse the existing system to bring in our new system. And what I'm getting at is that part of the reason that we're seeing and more of these weird manifestations, things being so crazy and so psychotic, is that we're literally sort of seeing the next level of reality, the next dimension, where the demonic is kind of like stepping over into, or the veil is thinning. Alex said that yesterday, right? Exactly. That's what I think is going on, partly because of the openness that human beings have to more and more spiritual realities and possibilities, which are manifesting oftentimes in a demonic way. I think a lot of these manifestations of what people are seeing, it's evil. But it's not all that. There are good spirits, good forces as well. There's a good God. So just as much as there are these evil manifestations, there will also be good. But as society gets more and more wicked and corrupt, I think we're going to see more and more evil manifestations, more wicked manifestations, more bizarre, strange, and so forth. It's only going to get crazier and weirder from here on out. And a lot of that has to do, again, with not just having an alternative perspective or being open to new things, but actually having a good perspective, actually having a good worldview, not any old worldview, but a solid, coherent, meaningful worldview, right? And it might not seem related to this, but I was thinking about the collapse in France and all the riots and all that. And there was a 2008 UK Ministry of Defense document paper. Alex has covered it for many years. And it was 2008. I think it's in the Guardian or the Telegraph. And it's talking about how the future, what we would see in the next several years, the future will be a society of chaos, mobs, collapse, etc., and the rise of another type of Marxism, it says, which I think is what we have with all the woke social justice. So basically, that 2008 Ministry of Defense document predicted everything that's happening right now. And the mobs and the riots and the chaos is also part of that dialectic, part of that system. A lot of people out there are literally becoming like NPC, sort of zombie controlled bot people, right? They're becoming more and more like that. And they're part of that circle of like the defined controlled system. And so they're set against a faux opponent, right? Of, evil crackers and honky people. Like the white people are the bad people that, they have to destroy to have their freedom, to have their liberty or whatever. And they really believe this because they've been programmed with this narrative. So they read reality in this way, with this weird worldview where they're completely programmed. It's an operating system. And, they see the demonic or the evil as people who are heterosexual Christian people, right? That's the worst person in the world to them because they're programmed with an evil paradigm, an evil worldview. But these worldviews always have to have some notion of good and evil, of the good and what's not the good, right? So it's amazing that you can tool an engineer and create worldviews so easily and export them and put them in people's minds like a program. And I don't want to overuse that analogy because I don't think we're just computers, but it's a great analogy, right? We run on various programs. And if your programming is a materialist naturalist worldview, or if your programming is the woke social justice worldview, that's why everything operates more like a cult. Everybody's worldview actually is some kind of a religious worldview, even if they're irreligious. Scientism and irreligious worldviews are actually a religious commitment. because they're founded on things that are not fundamentally openly religious, but are faith-based. For example, the scientific method can't prove the scientific method. Scientific method can't prove the law of induction, principle of uniformitarianism in nature. Scientific method can't prove the past. I mean, there's all kinds of metaphysical things that the scientific method can't prove, which shows that it's limited. But if it's exalted to be the be all end all of what exists and what doesn't exist, if it's taken out of its proper context, now it becomes like a religious thing. It's like a sort of pseudo god. And now the priest class of the pop, quote, science people, what did Fauci say? I am the science. Put your mask on. Take it off. It works, but it doesn't work. But also it works because I'm the science. Interesting. It's acting like a religion. Trust the science. Faith-based. So we all have these operating systems. And the question is, who has the better or worse operating system, right? I mean, nobody's going to be perfect. So, but we want to try to aim for the one that's the best, that's the truest, that makes the most sense, that's attuned to the good, right? This is what Plato talked about. And I was, listening to yesterday's show, and David and I was talking about this idea of, that we only hone in on like a certain bandwidth of the light spectrum, right? And that's the limited amount of what we can see. I think that's true. I think there's an insight there, because what that means is that there's all kinds of things going on in higher dimensions, other realities and so forth that we don't really understand or know about. But just because we don't understand or know about it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Doesn't mean that it doesn't relate to our reality. Just because I can't classify and scientifically explain all of the archetypes doesn't mean that there aren't comparative religious archetypes that are obviously in some sense real. So just because I can explain something or exhaustively define it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. That would be a fallacy. But he makes this point that, well, we only see a little bit of the color spectrum, so we don't really know what's going on beyond that. Things are really wild and complex, right, in these higher dimensions or spiritual worlds or whatever. I think that's true. And believe it or not, there's a Plato, a Platonic dialogue called the Phaedo. And there's this weird thing. I bring this up because the day before David Icke did his discussion yesterday, I was having a conversation with a professor. And this is a professor who did his focus work on Plato and Plato's works. And I said, well, I defer to you. You're a professor. I said, I've always wondered what's going on in Plato's Phaedo, because there's this, classic famous dialogue. And then at the end, Socrates kind of goes off into this weird discussion of higher dimensions and realities that we don't know or understand in those higher dimensions, and even talks about colors that we've never seen. He says there are colors that exist outside of our color spectrum. How would Socrates know that? I mean, we're talking about, 2,500 years ago in Greece. Isn't that wild? So then there's other things too in Plato's Timaeus, which is his mythology of the origin of the universe. There's discussions of the fundamental structures of reality being geometric, the Platonic solids. How would Plato know that reality, and you get really small into your microscope and down to the subatomic or whatever, you start to see geometric forms. This is one of the things that Wolfgang Pauli argues. He says that when you get down to this quantum level, whatever that is, where whatever's going on there, it has structure and form. And it wouldn't be that way if it was all pure chaos, you see, if there was no order or telos or purpose or design in the world. So not only is reality designed, it's highly designed and structured such that everything is meaningful. Every interaction is providential, is a synchronicity, so to speak, to use the Jungian and whatnot terminology, the mystical terminology. So it's the same idea of what providence is, right? And so the reason I say all that is that, okay, so we've got the elitist worldview, which has been this sort of Darwinian materialist view that they've programmed everybody to have from the top of the Royal Society all the way down for the last several centuries. And now what's happening is that people are moving into all kinds of other worldviews, but a lot of sort of, weird esoteric stuff, witchcraft, new agey stuff. And this is both good and bad. I mean, it's good in the sense that people are moving away from the materialist paradigm, but it's bad in the sense that people are now moving into something that might be even worse from the vantage point of what might manifest, the craziness, the chaos, right? So if we revert to kind of a brutalism and a paganism, society loses its ordering structure, its logos structure. Logos means reason. In the Bible, Jesus is called the Logos in John 1 because he's the personification of the divine. He is the manifestation of the divine reason. And so John in the Gospel of John is utilizing that archetype, that pattern from Greek philosophy, and saying that what the Greeks are searching for and grasping for, it's really in this person of the Logos, this divine person. And so that is an ordering structure, a principle, right? It gives the religion, the society, the structure, this kind of patriarchal model. And the archetype of the patriarch, of the Logos, it is order, it is structure, it is the father figure, right, who orders his house. And so if you think of society organized like a household, or even like a man, like Plato says, right, there's got to be the reasoning faculty kind of governing things. I don't agree with everything Plato says in the Republic, but that's one thing he says that I think is true. And one of the reasons that we've had this archetypal worldview warfare going on for so long against the patriarchy is so that society can be changed. In fact, some of these new agey esoteric authors, the people like Marilyn Ferguson and the SRI people and Friedolf Kopper, they actually talk about the need to destroy the archetype of a strong man or the patriarch or the father figure. And they understand that culture is this kind of mimetic archetypal warfare, meme magic type stuff or whatever, right? And that's symbolism in cartoons, symbolism in commercials, symbolism in movies and TV shows. All of that is part of this Weltanschauungskrieg, this worldview warfare of attacking and going after archetypes. The father archetype was very crucial to be destroyed. And this has been the process of happening. They've been going after this notion for a long time. It's not just third wave feminism. This goes back to even in the French Revolution. You had a lot of weirdos who were saying that to have a revolution in society, we'd have to destroy the distinction between male and female because ordered societies typically have a logos patriarchal principle. You have to destroy that as well as destroying the mother archetype to completely destroy and reorganize society. And that is a weapon, and it is done intentionally, and they study this. This is what I'm trying to tell you. Military experts, warfare experts, psychological warfare experts, they study worldview warfare because, as we all know, what did Sun Tzu say, right? Basically, that if you really want to win the war, it's winning the mind. It's not actually the battlefield. The battlefield is secondary to the mind war. The mind war is, from the vantage point of the elite, what Kissinger said, right? It was control the perception. Doesn't matter what the event is, control the perception of the event. That's all that matters. Controlling perception of everything in the circle, the magic circle of the controllers. And while it's true that you can step out of that circle and you can start to get into other models of reality, just because you step out of the circle doesn't mean it's necessarily good. You might step into something bad or worse, right? So maybe, I'm going to be into witchcraft now. Ooh, I'm a millennial. I'm a witch now because science is faking gay or something. I don't know what the reason, but that's not any better, is what I'm saying. All of these systems are predicated on lies, deception, programming, and basically anything that fits into the technocratic global paradigm. Any religions that don't fit that either are discarded or worldviews, or have to be modified. That's why the world religion that they're really pushing and trying to bring forth and manifest, that world religion has to get rid of or change or cut off anything in the other religions that's not amenable to technocracy. So really the world religion that they're trying to create and push, the fake one, it's just a tool of the technocratic elite. I was reading a book that I recommend that's really good on this stuff. And now you might think, well, this is dated. It's 1979. Why would I want to read a book from 1979? Well, you've heard, I'm sure, Alex talk about books by Gary Allen and all these kind of classics. Well, there's another one of these that a lot of people have overlooked, which is from Professor Anthony Sutton that he wrote with the technocrat expert Patrick Wood. It's called Trilaterals Over Washington by Patrick Wood and Professor Sutton. And the reason this is good is that everything that we see, for example, the Trilateral Commission in 1979 planning has come to pass. And why would we care? Isn't it too late? No. So if we look back to these global institutions and what they said they wanted to do by where we are now, if that has come to pass, then doesn't it stand to reason that the same global institutions are probably telling us now what they're going to do in the next 10, 20 years? Absolutely. It's the same people at WEF, Davos, same people that go to Bilderberg, same people that go to the Trilateral Commission. It's all the same people. Okay, so these are just names for steering committees, which are made up of people. The people are who matter, and the people are the ones that go to all the same groups. Now, probably a lot of the 1979 Trilateral Commission people have passed away. David Rockefeller, obviously, was a big player there. Well, he's no longer with us. George Soros, right? These kinds of people. But it's not just George Soros that sort of begins this. That's what Daniel Estlin was saying in a great interview that Alex did this week, right? It doesn't begin with George Soros. No, this is an old plan of tearing down borders, tearing down economic tariffs and all of that to have totally open free trade that then puts in place the global system. And Sutton and Wood note that, for example, you might think, oh, China is the enemy. China's the enemy. I mean, it's an intentionally created dialectical foil. That's the point. He says they were writing this in 1979 about the rise of China. The policy of the normalization of relations with communist China. Remember, America's supposed to be this capitalist country, right? This capitalist nation versus the communists, the Soviets. This was implemented as a program to build up China technologically into a superpower. It was done by Zbigniew Brzezinski under David Rockefeller. And as the 1979 or 78 Anthony Sutton Trilateral report said, it was implemented as Zbig's baby more than anyone else. Zbig did 99% of the work for Rockefeller in terms of China. And why do I say that? Because that's a circle. That's a magic circle that everybody was supposed to, well, you choose America or China. No, the global elites, they're the ones that are above American China. They're the ones that promoted China. And so the chaos that we see, right, this collapsing in France and all that chaos, all that crazy, all these manifestations of madness that we're seeing are only going to increase. It's only going to get crazier. And you need to support Alex at the InfoWar store. Get those products and keep the show going, and jasonanalysis.com.